at what it is that Jesus is communicating about himself through these different events, and how Mark has arranged them on purpose to make a different points about Jesus and his ministry. We've seen that Jesus has a teaching ministry as his primary ministry, but as part of that ministry, he does miracles along the way to both confirm that he is the Son of God, that he has the authority to teach the things he's teaching, and to confirm the truthfulness of the message that he's preaching, so that people will come to genuinely follow him and follow his message. We've already seen that Jesus has absolute power over our physical bodies, as he's healed several people with different ailments. We've seen that Jesus has the authority and power to forgive sins, even as we saw with the man who was paralyzed. We've seen that Jesus has power over the demons, and that the demons have to obey. As soon as Jesus tells them to flee, they must flee. And last time we even saw that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That is, he is God himself, the one who instituted the Sabbath. And as we saw in our last miracle, where he heals the man on the Sabbath day, proving his heart for the Sabbath, what he intended for the Sabbath to be, and the fact that he has the right to definitively say what the Sabbath is for and what it's not. Well, we left off last time in chapter 3 with, as I mentioned, the healing of the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath day. After that account, in verse 13 of chapter 3, Jesus chooses his 12 disciples. Now understand that Jesus had many disciples. He had a larger group of people than just the 12 that were following him. But from that larger group, he selected 12 specific men who would become really his pre-authenticated messengers, authoritative messengers, who would continue on the ministry of Christ after Jesus ascended to the Father. Now we know that one of the 12, Judas, was a traitor, and Jesus knew that from the beginning, and he was chosen to fulfill the Scriptures. He would ultimately be replaced by Matthias, and we know that the Apostle Paul would also be added to the number of the apostles. But these were men that Jesus spent a lot of time with to prepare them for ministry. And what we see is that right from this point on in verse 13, Jesus immediately begins to spend individual time with the disciples. At times, especially with 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, who rose to have a leadership position within the 12 even. Peter then arising finally to be the leader of the 12, and John being the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, after choosing the 12, it's interesting because if you think about the disciples, these 12 from human characteristics were really nothing special. Many of them were fishermen. I think as many as 7 of them were fishermen. We know we have a tax collector in their ranks in Matthew. Tax collectors, of course, were basically outcasts for the Jewish people because they were Jews who had, in the eyes of the Jewish people, sold out to the Romans. They were doing the Romans' dirty work. And so we have this strange group of men that Jesus has brought together, and yet they follow him and they believe in him, except for Judas, of course. And what's interesting is right after choosing the 12, we see that both Jesus' family members and the religious leaders of the day reject Jesus initially. In verse 21, his family comes to get him because they think he's out of his mind. His brothers and sisters, they're coming to get him, or I guess maybe to save the family some embarrassment. Jesus, of course, doesn't go with them. And then in verse 22, we see that the scribes come down from Jerusalem. They begin accusing Jesus of doing the miracles that he's doing, not by the power of God, but by the power of Satan. This is the sin of the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. They're attributing to Satan genuine works of God, and saying that he's doing it by the power of Satan, which of course is blasphemy. And so we see that the people who should have been receiving him the most, his immediate family and the scribes, religious leaders of the day, they're rejecting him. And yet here are these disciples, this mixed bag of guys from kind of nameless professions that are following after him. And at the end of this section in verse 35 in chapter 3, Jesus identifies who the true citizens of his kingdom are. And it has nothing to do with their relation to him by blood. But instead, in verse 35, he says, "For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." Now we know that Jesus' family comes to know him and embrace him after the resurrection, but at this time they are still skeptical and unbelieving. Now after this account, Jesus goes into 3 kingdom parables. Each of these parables define a different aspect of Christ's kingdom, and in this case, all 3 of them deal with seeds and soil. The first parable is the parable of the soils, or the parable of the sower, we may have heard it called. In this parable, he identifies that the true disciples or true kingdom citizens are those who bear fruit, who not only receive the gospel message, but actually bear the fruit of righteousness. These are those who are genuinely saved. Secondly, he gives us another kingdom parable about seeds and talks about the fact that the kingdom of God is like a seed that is planted, and overnight, even though the farmer doesn't have any power to make it grow, it grows. The idea is that God is the divine power, the divine agent through whom the gospel is sent out and bears its fruit and does its work in the heart. And ultimately, it says, "But when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come." So God causes that gospel to be sent out. He makes that seed of the gospel come to fruition and ultimately bear fruit, and that person comes to salvation. And then finally, we see a parable of the mustard seed. And in this case, he's making the point that the kingdom of God has very humble beginnings, as we've already mentioned, with these 12 men, not to mention Jesus' own humble beginnings, being born in kind of a backwater town of Bethlehem from the town of Nazareth, born to parents who were poor, even under the speculation, false speculation, but speculation nonetheless, that Mary had been either unfaithful or that she and Joseph had been together before marriage. And so really the humblest of beginnings, and yet this kingdom, just like the tiny mustard seed, starts with humble beginnings, but will become something that affects the entire world. And we've seen that even today. We even keep track of years based upon the birth of Christ. Certainly that has come to pass. But right after these 3 kingdom parables, Mark gives us 4 of Jesus's miracles. And we're going to deal with the first of those tonight, and then we'll walk through all 4 of them in the weeks to come. But the first of these miracles is one of my favorites, and it is Jesus calms the sea. So let's look at Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. "On that day, when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in a boat, just as he was, and other boats were with them. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?' They became very much afraid and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Now, this is a fascinating account that yet again highlights the divinity of Christ. Let's walk back through it together verse by verse. It says it was on that day, that is the same day that he'd been teaching these kingdom parables. And we see that in Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, that the crowd was so large around Jesus that he actually got into a boat and had pushed out away from the shoreline on the boat and then set anchor so that he could get some relief from the people and actually teach them. It gave them the chance to see him better and hear him better, and also it gave him a little bit of distance from the crowds pressing in around him. And it was now near evening. He'd been teaching and healing all day. No doubt he was exhausted. And we see here the humanity of Christ. And he tells his disciples that now he wants them to leave this side of the Sea of Galilee and to go to the other. Right now they're on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and so they'll be headed to the eastern side. We're not exactly sure why this is, but we can make some assumptions based on the context. One, the western side was on the side of Capernaum. Remember, that was his ministry headquarters. There was a large city there, so the crowds were large. There were a lot of people there. And if he wanted to get a break and get some rest with his disciples, then he needed to go to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, which at the time was largely uninhabited. I mean, there were people there, but there weren't any large cities there. Not to mention, we'll find out after this account that the next miracle he does is healing the demoniac, the man that had many demons. And so he has a divine appointment that he's planning on with this man on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So that ultimately is the reason that he was headed in that direction. But when you think about the Sea of Galilee, if you've never been to Israel, understand the Sea of Galilee is actually a lake. It's not salt water, it's fresh water, and it's not even that large of a lake. I think it's somewhere around 13 miles wide by 7 miles long, in that range. So if you've ever been out on Grapevine Lake, it's a little bit bigger than Grapevine Lake, but it's similar in the sense that if you're out in the middle of the lake, you can see all of the banks of the lake. Even though they're in the distance, you can see all the way around. So it's actually not that large, but it was a very popular lake, very prosperous for fishermen, a lot of fish, and obviously a source of fresh water as well. So he's getting into the boat on the western side of the lake, or the Sea of Galilee, and he's going to be heading across to the eastern side. And he specifically says, leaving the crowd. So we're to infer that perhaps that was part of the issue, needing to get away for some rest. It says, leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat. So Jesus is already in the boat, so they just pull up anchor and begin to take off across the lake. They take him just as he was. That is, just he was already in the boat. He didn't go get off and get anything else. He just started out across the lake. And there were other boats with him. So these probably were your typical fishing boat. They weren't large enough to have all of the disciples in one boat, particularly when you take into account that more than just the 12 were traveling with him. The larger group of disciples were also traveling. So there were several boats together in this little caravan heading across the Sea of Galilee. Now in verse 37, something interesting happens. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Now here's something interesting about the Sea of Galilee, or this lake, that's still true today. We see this happening even now. It's surrounded, for one, predominantly by large hills. They're larger in some areas than others, but it's very hilly. And so the lake forms almost kind of a bowl. And when the cool air comes down over those hills and meets with the warm air of the lake, it often creates very violent storms. And they can happen very, very suddenly. And that's exactly what happens here. Now don't forget that a large number of these men, probably at least 7 of the disciples, were fishermen. And they were fishermen on this lake in particular. So picture growing up on Lake Grapevine, and as your profession and your father's profession and passed down to you, you were fishing this lake. They knew this lake in and out. They were on it all the time. This was their major profession before Christ called them into ministry and following him. And so not only did they know the lake, but they knew the storms of this lake very, very well. They would have been able to read the clouds and the wind and things like that to know the storm was coming. But this storm comes on them so suddenly, there's no way to prepare for it. But what's interesting is the storm is so strong that says that the waves were breaking over the boat so that much of the boat was already filling up. Picture huge waves crashing against this wooden fishing boat, and it's already filling up with water. And so, of course, they're going to sink if they don't do something. It's coming in faster than they can bail it out. This is a very scary situation. And you know that if the disciples are scared, then this must have been a very unique storm, because no doubt these men had been through many storms out on this lake. And yet, if they're terrified and they're not able to handle the situation, then this was no ordinary storm. And like I said, this happens even in modern times. In 1992, for instance, which has been some years ago now, but MacArthur mentions in his commentary, there was a storm there that was so strong, the wind is so strong, that the waves reached 10 feet in height and actually did a lot of flooding and a lot of damage. So you can imagine on this lake, it gets really, really choppy. These are huge waves and they're crashing over, and the boat is in serious trouble and perhaps about to sink. Now, here's the interesting thing. On the one hand, you have chaos, right? And in fact, the Greek word for a fierce gale of wind is actually the word great. A great wind, that this huge wind comes upon them. That word great is going to be important because Mark's going to repeat it. If you have the ESV translation, the ESV does a little bit better here at capturing the way that he uses the word great. This huge, great wind comes upon them. It's stirring up the water on the Sea of Galilee. And there's chaos on the one hand, but in verse 28, there's complete calm when it comes to Jesus. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Now, on the one hand, this points to Jesus' humanity, all right? I mean, he's exhausted. He's literally been ministering all day long. He's wiped out, and so he immediately lays down. He must have fallen asleep pretty quickly after they got into this voyage. And he's out. And he must have been really tired, because if it's this kind of storm with the boat about to sink, that means he's gotten wet, there's waves coming over, and yet he's still sleeping through the whole thing. So on the one side of the story, we have the humanity of Christ, but also we see the fact that Jesus intentionally wants to make a point out of this storm. So it's not a coincidence that Jesus is asleep. The disciples now, we can assume, after having tried everything that they knew to try, of bailing out water and whatever it may be, they run over to Jesus, it says, and they woke him, and they said to him, now listen to what they say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now think about that. These are now men who have spent a lot of time with Jesus. They have seen the compassion of Christ. They have seen him heal people, even when that healing put him in direct conflict with very powerful religious leaders. They've seen him care for people that the rest of society saw as an outcast. Certainly they had by this time experienced his love and care and provision for them. And so they must have been in extreme terror and extreme circumstances to really question the character of Jesus here. But that's basically what they do. "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" They're saying, are you not even concerned? You're asleep? In fact, the text is emphatic here when it says Jesus himself was asleep. It's intended to make this great contrast. The disciples are terrified. Jesus himself is asleep. And the disciples mistake his sleepiness for a lack of care, a lack of concern. But we're going to find out that they are absolutely wrong in their assessment of the situation. Verse 39, and he got up, and look at what Jesus does, and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." He uses two different commands here, hush and be still. He tells the wind to hush. He tells the sea to be still. Now, this is different than anything the disciples have ever seen before. Indeed, it would be different than anything any of us have ever seen before. They've seen Jesus heal people. They've seen Jesus talk to demons and cast out demons. But Jesus, to this point, has never spoken directly to the elements, right, as he does here, to wind and to sea. But what's even more astonishing is not that Jesus rebukes the wind and the sea, but the response of the wind and the sea. Notice at the end of verse 39, and the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. Literally, the text says, and there was a great calm. So there was a great wind, and now there is a great calm. Understand, the idea is not that Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and then slowly the wind died down, and there was, some residual waves, and then after, 10 or 15 minutes, things settled down. The picture given here is that immediately Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves. He commands them to hush and be still, and it goes from utter chaos. About to die, boat going to sink, waves crashing overboard, to calm. It's if you've ever been out to the lake early in the morning, right when the sun comes up, before the wind really gets going, the lake will look just like glass. If you're a water skier, this is like paradise for water skiers. To get that water just like glass. It looks literally just as smooth as it can be without a wrinkle. That's the idea. There was a great wind, absolute chaos, and in the moment, just soon as Jesus says the word, boom, glass. Now you think about it. You put yourself in the boat. You've been in situations that are scary before. Imagine your adrenaline rushing, your heart pounding, and truly being afraid that this is it. There is no way. It's too far to swim. The waves are too violent. If we go down, we are done. From that to, in a moment, complete still. Certainly the waters had stopped their raging, but the hearts of the disciples must have still been pounding, as now they are moving away from fear of the storm to fear of the one that's in the boat. Look at what he says in verse 40. Jesus turns to them and he said, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" Literally, he says, "Do you still have no faith?" So he's not saying why is it that you don't have faith. He's saying, really, do you still not have faith? The idea is, after all that you've seen, after all that you've experienced with me along the way, all of the miracles you've seen me do, all of the personal concern that I've shown for you, all the teaching that I have done, you really still don't have faith. And notice their response, verse 41. They became very much afraid. Literally, it's that word great again. And they feared a great fear is the literal translation. So you have this word great reiterated 3 different times. A great wind came upon them, followed by a great calm, followed by a great fear. But this time, as I said, the fear is not of the storm. The fear is of who in the world is this in the boat. And we know that because of what they said. They became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, you tell me, what is it that Jesus, and now Mark, by including this, is wanting us to understand about who he is? Who is it that has power to speak to the wind and the waves, to the storm, and the storm immediately and perfectly obey their words? It can only be God. It can only be God. And so here again, we have the divinity of Christ on display. And this is why it's so important to understand that while it may sound like people are trying to be kind and tolerant when they say things like, Jesus was a good guy and he had compassion, and there's some characteristics of his personality that we should implement, but let's not go too far here. After all, he didn't really claim to be God. Really? I'm not being sarcastic. I'm being honest. If you just read through the New Testament, can you really come away with that assessment? Just taking any gospel, read any one of them, and you cannot come away with an honest assessment of that gospel without recognizing at least that Jesus and the gospel writers claimed that he was in fact God. There is no other explanation for this. And this is explicitly what's taught in the New Testament. In fact, the Apostle Paul picks up on this idea, and we're going to come to this wonderful text here in a couple of weeks in Colossians. But listen to what Paul says about Jesus that gives him the ability and the power to do what we just saw him do in the Gospel of Mark. Listen to this description from Paul. This is Colossians 1, beginning in verse 15. He, that is Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For, listen to this, by him all things were created. What do you mean by all things? Well, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Why is it that Jesus could heal the sick? Why is it that Jesus could tell a demon to get out and he would immediately have to obey Jesus? Why is it that Jesus could speak to the wind and the waves and actually have them immediately obey him? It's because he is Creator God. That's it. That's the explanation. The Creator of all things visible and invisible. That is every kind of power, whether it's an angel or a demon, or whether it's a human king, you name it. God is Creator and has authority over all of them. And he proves that here yet again by speaking to the wind and the waves. And the disciples' reaction confirms that. The fear that they felt and the question that they asked was not because at this point they really had the question. It was that the question had been answered. They knew the answer to the question was God alone can control the wind and the waves. And so when they say, who is this in the boat? What they're saying is, God is in the boat with us. That's what they're saying. They're amazed. They're having the same reaction that we see people have all throughout human history when they encounter a true revelation of God himself. They're terrified. They're in awe. They're fully in awe of his holiness and his power. That's what's happening here among the disciples. Now, as we think about what Jesus has done here, and this is just one of a list of 4 miracles that Jesus performs in rapid succession here in the Gospel of Mark. But as we think about this, what I want us to understand is that there's a legitimate application here for us. One, to respond to Jesus in the right way. To confess that Jesus Christ is God in human flesh. And that is the only appropriate response to him. But secondly, there's an even more personal response. And that is understanding that this illustration of Jesus in the boat calming the storm helps us understand that Jesus is still Lord of the storm. Of every kind of storm. What that means is that in your personal life, when you experience difficulties, understand that God is sovereign. He's just as sovereign today as he was that day when he was in the boat. And notice that Jesus was in the boat and yet the storm still came. What does that mean? It means it must have been Jesus' will for the storm to come. And in this case, Jesus used the storm as an avenue to explain and to manifest his divinity. But understand, in our lives, God allows different trials and storms to come into our lives, and he doesn't always sovereignly seek to take them away at a moment's notice. But what we can take comfort in is that he's always in the boat. Jesus is always with us in the midst of the storm. And even if he doesn't take it away, he is absolutely sovereign over the storm. And here's the good news. If Jesus is sovereign over the storm and he's with us in the midst of the storm and he doesn't take it away from us, that must mean that he intends to use that storm for our spiritual good. That Jesus has an intention for the storm and it's good. And as we saw on Sunday, he will give us the strength to endure that storm for his glory. And so I would encourage you this evening, if you've been in the midst of a storm, maybe it's this epidemic that we're in the middle of, maybe that's caused you some anxiety because of hardships and finances or fear about your personal health, or maybe it's a totally unrelated trial that you've been in the midst of for some time. Understand, we need to not respond as the disciples did when in despair they essentially accused Jesus of not caring for them. Jesus proved that that was absolutely wrong, because Jesus does care for us. Instead, what we need to do is remind ourselves of all the ways in the Scripture and in our personal lives that Jesus has been faithful and good to us. We have to remember that we have every reason to trust Him, and we have no reasons not to trust Him. That He is good. He is sovereign over every storm. And so that means He's sovereign over the storm that you're in, if you're in one today. And He'll use it for His good purposes. So I don't want us to miss the opportunity to grow through the storms of life that God brings to us. But I don't want us to miss the opportunity to trust in our amazing God in the midst of these. We serve the God of the universe, the Creator God, who is Lord not only of the Sabbath, but He's Lord of all creation. I hope that's an encouragement to you this evening. Have a great night.